Welcome, everybody. So nice to be in a room with you all, full of so much energy and excitement. We love it. I'm Ashley Bohrer. I'm an assistant professor of gender and peace studies here at the Kroc Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the fall 2024 Intersectionality and Peace lecture series. Today we have the great honor of having Professor Marsha Henry as our speaker. Dr. Henry is the Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton Chair in Women, Peace and Security and Justice at the Mitchell Institute at Queen's University in Belfast. Professor Henry's research focuses on gender, peace and security, gender and militarization, gender and development, and intersectional feminist methodologies. She's published in, it would take me way too much time to read off her incredibly impressive CV, but she's published in a bunch of leading journals, including Security Dialogue, Qualitative Research, Conflict, Security and Development, and Globalizations. Over the past 20 years, her research has really focused on documenting the experiences of living and working in peacekeeping missions in particular. I think we're going to hear a bit about her newest book, which is really exciting, based on this ethnographic research. That book is called The End of Peacekeeping, Gender, Race, and Martial Politics of Intervention, which just came out with the University of Pennsylvania Press earlier this year. Dr. Henry's talk is called Intersectional Beginnings and Abolitionist Endings, Decolonial, Feminist, and Anti-Militarist Theorizing Peacekeeping. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Henry to the Kroc Institute.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for, it's an incredible warm welcome, although the temperature has suddenly gone in a different direction. Although there was weather warnings all week, and I was thinking that's going to happen. Everyone's panicking at the weather stations, but it seems like it has, the blanket of snow has arrived. So I want to thank Ashley and Ari in particular, who've been impeccable at organizing this whole thing. I've been sending loads of text messages to different colleagues and friends back in the UK, just saying how shameful it is the way in which we don't properly welcome scholars and academics and students when they come, and that we could learn a lot about how to host people and make them feel incredibly comfortable. And it feels really like, I shouldn't say, this bit's being recorded, so I shouldn't say that. It feels a little bit like a holiday. It's really, really nice. And I guess that's also part of Kroc and Notre Dame. And, you're so grateful for that amazing welcome. Okay, so I'm gonna talk to you about the book project and the book overall, and then hopefully we can tease out, and I'm sure you'll have questions about the, if I don't go into enough detail about the intersectional aspects of the work or the abolitionist endings part of the work. Hopefully we can, bring that out a bit more and have a more detailed discussion about that afterwards. But I kind of want to take you through the journey of the book and what I hope to do in the book, and what I think I mostly do, but there's scope for more. So yeah, even though the book is finished and I can't change the book, I'm certainly open to hearing, your critical feedback on things and some of the ideas that I'm working with. Okay, so I come to this is sort of it's a strange thing whenever I present on it, and whenever I talk to, anyone in my neighborhood, or, sometimes people, I was on a train a couple of weeks ago heading to London, and this person sitting beside me saw the book and all the Post-it notes that I have in the margins, on the edge of the pages. And he was like, whoa, that looks like a good book. And I was like, thank you. No, I said, I've got to keep track of arguments that I make, because it took me 20 years really to write this book. There were all these kind of, I guess like there were these sort of things that annoyed me or that troubled me, and I was kind of holding them for 20 years. And so it took a while to lay them all out. And, you know, sometimes I even think, oh, I wish I put that in the book. I've forgotten about it. So what happened was in around the early 2000s, I started a new position at the University of Bristol, and I previously worked in the broad field of sort of gender and development. And I'd been interested in representations, and I'd also done empirical work interviewing women about a totally different topic, nothing to do with peacekeeping. So a colleague of mine at the time said, well, you know, I have all this background on gender and militarization. I've done stuff on military masculinities and so on. And, you know, perhaps we could kind of combine areas of expertise. You do stuff on gender and development, and we could do this project, because I read this report. It was Save the Children report about sexual exploitation and abuse in humanitarian settings. Mainly, the report identified peacekeepers as the perpetrators of this form of gender-based violence. And I was like, okay, so we put this project together, and we kind of harnessed both of our areas of expertise. But I came, you know, so both of us then immersed ourselves in the peacekeeping scholarship. It's again, it sounds really strange to most IR scholars, most peace scholars, most any scholars. Like, why would anyone study exclusively peacekeeping? Like, it seems like a very niche sort of area. But I guess I generally use peacekeeping as a sort of broad term to encompass really humanitarian and disaster interventionist spaces more broadly. So even though I'm talking about specific United Nations missions and operations, I'm really like speaking to, I believe, the broader humanitarian intervention. So we started immersing ourselves in this literature on peacekeeping, and we were a little bit like, I was a little bit surprised in a way, because a large bit of it was, well, I turned to the obvious feminist, postcolonial and critical race and anti-militarist sort of accounts. So this was in the early 2000s. And in the early 2000s, there was this like big collection of mainly feminist, but also post-colonial work. And so I was really inspired by that work, and I thought it was really engaging, and it drew on my own background in gender studies. So I had, my PhD was in gender studies, which was somewhat of a rare thing. You couldn't get a PhD in gender studies at that time. And so I had this, kind of repository of feminist and decolonial and intersectional kind of knowledge that I was bringing with me as I was approaching this peacekeeping literature. And so at the time that we immersed ourselves in this literature, I identified, like two major sort of, fields of scholarship. One that we named the problem-solving literature, and the other, which we saw as the critical approaches. I mean, this is like very crudely, because there's some people that kind of go in between, or, chart a third way, or, don't consider themselves to belong to any of these categories that we sort of created and that resonate, I think, with others. So you can imagine the problem-solving literature was very much like, well, from the outset, it was like, we need peacekeeping, and it's still very, very dominant today. You'll hear that in both media reports, but also in the scholarship. We need peacekeeping. We need to intervene in places where people can't defend themselves or can't resolve the conflicts that have been in their immediate past. And so peacekeeping provides this deterrent. And so the problem-solving literature is all about, like, how do we make sure peacekeeping is okay? How do we improve it? How do we make it, incredibly efficient? The critical approaches, and again, you won't be surprised at this, the critical approaches, mostly drew on, and I'm going to use this term, but I don't think anybody uses it anymore, but post-structuralist sort of somebody does.
My students are nodding their heads.
Okay, good. So yeah, it was mostly people who had, had been exposed to certain kinds of post-structuralist, postmodern, and other kinds of critical theories. And they sort of said, well, actually, what we need to do when we look at peacekeeping is start from its design and its inception, its kind of foundational thinking. And most of that critical work was, again, you'll not be surprised, was very much feminist work that was sort of saying, well, actually, if we look at peacekeeping, it's extremely male dominated in practice, and it's also very androcentric in its ideology, in its doctrine, in the way it's laid out. And that, yeah, so there were a couple of key texts in this early period. Some of those are edited collections. And again, I'll come back to this, hopefully at the end. But these texts that I'm telling you about, they very rarely appear on contemporary syllabi, right? Like, so, and they are very rarely cited actually in work, even work on gender and peacekeeping in the last 10, 15 years. Most of these texts don't really appear and they're not really engaged with. So a couple of those, for example, Sandra Whitworth in 2004, Men, Militarism, and Peacekeeping, I think it's called. I should know these off by heart, but I don't. Sorry. And an edited collection by Angela Raven Roberts, Jane Parpar, Angela Raven Roberts, and Diane Mazarana, which was specifically on peacekeeping and gender. It had these amazing chapters in the book. One of the chapters was an article about gender training, the first article on gender training and peacekeeping. And this was 2004. And then, you had, again, this edited collection, I think, is probably one of the most fantastic texts. It was edited by the late Cynthia Coburn and Dubravka Zarkov, and it was specifically on masculinity and peacekeeping. One of the chapters that I found the most compelling in that book was a chapter where Cynthia Coburn and another scholar, Melanie Hubich, they actually interviewed women who were providing sexual services for peacekeepers and asked them, I think it was like, it probably is one of the prevailing studies that actually asks people what they think should be done to resolve the financial and economic, the politics of really of peacekeeping economies. And and the women that Hubich interviewed were really saying, we want safety and we want to be paid what has been negotiated. So it was really early study of this. And again, as I said, not very much of the literature since then has acknowledged these kind of important studies. And maybe one other kind of important study book that has been really formative in my work is a book by Shireen Razik, which was also published in 2004. 2004 was like a really big year for peacekeeping, and then it's all downhill since. It's called Dark Threats, White Nights. And what Razik does is Razik traces a case, a sort of an example of colonial violence, what she calls colonial violence, committed by peacekeepers against a young man in Somalia who was assaulted and killed by a particular regiment, by several members of a Canadian regiment stationed there. And you can see, actually, if you, normally I would have have this up as one of the slides, but one of the editions of the book has a really important image on the cover, which is available in the Canadian Military Archives, but it's a picture of from the regiment's collection. They were given photographic collection, and it's a picture of the chaplain, the military chaplain, standing sort of behind 4 children who are, they're with their hands bound behind their back and they're blindfolded and they have signs on their chest, which you can't quite read in the image. But basically, it was a kind of public shaming that happened near the barracks for any local person that would be caught allegedly stealing items from the container, from the military supplies of the peacekeepers. So really, it's a really haunting image on that cover, considering the arguments that she uses in the book. Anyway, so these books, again, like I said, I think a lot of people do cite Razek's work and these other works. It's just that they tend to cite it in the critical literature. So these literatures, the problem-solving literature, the critical approaches tend to be pretty separate, and they don't speak to each other very often. So I decided, that so I was doing all this field work for another book that I wrote with a colleague called Insecure Spaces. And this was the book that was supposed to be about sexual exploitation and abuse in peacekeeping missions. But when we got to these peacekeeping missions and started speaking with people, they really didn't want to talk about that subject. They didn't want to focus on sexual exploitation and abuse. They told us narratives that, you might find in many post-conflict settings, which were issues about survival, issues about insecurity more broadly, about distances between places, accessing resources, repatriation to their communities of sort of where they had originally been living before the conflict. And they told us a lot about their impressions of peacekeepers and the United Nations. So we wrote a very different book than we set out to. But one of the things we argued in this book is that peacekeeping is, a socio-spatial project, that basically it has this significant impact on spaces. Not that they're already blank spaces, because that's what peacekeeping actually assumes. It assumes that when they set up like a checkpoint, for example, the peacekeepers often regulate that checkpoint as if there wasn't a history to that neighborhood or that space prior to that. This was what we ended up looking at. We ended up looking at the kind of spatial impact of peacekeeping and how that contributed to security or insecurity for both what I refer to in the new book as the peace kept, but also for peacekeepers themselves and other humanitarian workers. So what I wanted to do in this project was to sort of say, hey, if you as a reader come through the journey that I went on, which was to really pay attention to feminist and postcolonial and critical race scholarship on peacekeeping, maybe you might not be so convinced by some of the arguments in the problem-solving literature. Maybe, if we just given sort of equal or a majority sort of attention to this more critical stuff, much of it was anti-militarist as well. It was really coming out of a marginal sort of faction within peace studies and peace activism. Maybe you might come to a different conclusion about what you think about peacekeeping and where you're ready to send peacekeepers. So I actually talk in this book about peacekeeping as an epistemic project. And what I mean by that is that peacekeeping is something constructed. It's something made by both the United Nations, their official policies, their official resolutions, the way they represent themselves on Twitter, Twitter basically doesn't exist anymore, but, on various platforms where they promote their activities. But it's also something that's constructed by peacekeepers themselves. Although Razek argues in her book that, one of the things that she was asked and that myself and my colleague were asked about the previous book was, well, is it, the peacekeepers who are behaving badly, as it was often referred to, or the peacekeepers that aren't particularly, cognizant of the traumas that people have experienced? Are those peacekeepers mainly from the global South? Is it because those militaries are not, as progressive or developed or, and she always sort of argued back, Razek argued back that actually, if you focus on the sort of micropolitics or of the individual peacekeeper, you can't see the larger sort of power relations behind it. So what she said was that, you know, peacekeeping is kind of like, if we see it as a kind of colonial stage, or if you see it as something in which, a space in which these colonial scripts are acted out, then you won't necessarily focus on the specific ethnic or national identity of the peacekeeper, because you'll see that peacekeeper as contributing to this overall sort of system of power relations. So that's what I wanted to kind of bring into peacekeeping as an epistemic project. So when peacekeepers told me different stories about their experiences, I felt like it was them both bringing knowledge that they had from other, you know, contexts, from their own personal lives, but also contributing to a certain kind of a set of constructions or representations of peacekeeping spaces and the peace kept. And so the reason that I refer to them as the peace kept throughout the book is connected with this idea of peacekeeping as an epistemic project. So an author named Clapham wrote about the peace kept in a kind of provocative way to sort of like emphasize the object status that people who are living in peacekeeping missions are often constructed as, but also, so really I use peace kept in this way because I want to continually draw your attention to the asymmetry of power that's at play in a UN peacekeeping mission. So, so I talk about peacekeeping as this epistemic project, and I have, you know, various examples, and then I sort of treat these, I like kind of somewhat crudely, I break them up into chapters, and I sort of take gender, race, and the marshal in, you know, sort of in succession. What I start off with really the concept of the global color line, which Razik uses in her work and other people have used in different, and I use it quite simply. I use intersectionality quite simply as well. But what I do with the global color line is to extend it beyond just sort of global North UN, sort of the architects of peacekeeping and the peace kept, but I also look at you know, who are the majority of peacekeepers, right? Like where do they come from? I mean, this sounds like I'm contradicting what I previously said about the colonial scripts and the colonial stage, but actually I want to look at like which peacekeepers does the UN care about, or which peacekeepers are doing the majority of this peacekeeping labor, and what are the consequences for them? How do they relate to the people around them? So if you've come across anything more recently on peacekeeping, and perhaps you've seen some of the reports about peacekeepers being attacked and or peacekeepers under threat in Lebanon, for example. This narrative about peacekeepers under threat is actually one that has been pushed by scholars as well as high-ranking military personnel from a variety of places. It's a narrative about the sort of greatest threat in peacekeeping missions, according to this problem-solving advocates, is the threat to peacekeepers, right? So you'll often hear of cases where peacekeepers have been killed, and there was quite a significant number killed in the Democratic Republic of Congo during the mid 2000 or during the early 2000s. And again, this became a kind of dominant narrative, like it's becoming very dangerous for peacekeepers. There was an older generation of peacekeeping, which was really about, maintaining a ceasefire line or maintaining a barrier between warring parties. But in the early 2000s, peacekeeping missions changed quite a bit, and they started to do much more humanitarian and development work. And there was even a case where peacekeepers were providing HIV and AIDS education, for example, education brackets, in quotation marks. So Yeah, so this global color line is actually a concept that I use to critique this idea that all peacekeepers are created equally, because really the concern about peacekeepers' lives is also a kind of foil for thinking about what's happening to the peace kept, the kind of structural inequalities that are perpetuated and maintained by peacekeeping missions. So that's what I kind of do with the global color line. And I look at, for example, maybe I could give you a couple of examples of some of the things that came up so that you can kind of relate to what I was seeing when I was doing my field work. So again, I don't know if any of you know, but there was this big push to increase the number of female peacekeepers in peacekeeping missions. And this coincided with various kinds of gender initiatives at the United Nations. So the Indian government proposed sending an all-female, as they referred to, an all-female contingent of sort of not military police, but militarized police, right? So these police were trained in riot and crowd control, and they were sort of like weapons experts. And they weren't, they weren't peacekeepers who had any specific training on gender, like there have been, for example, peacekeepers who have expertise on domestic violence and creation of domestic violence cells in police stations, but those individuals generally were not sent because of that knowledge. They just happened to be in missions. So this group of 120 female peacekeepers, they were a really fascinating group, and they were sort of presented by the UN in various kinds of ways as a kind of kind of crowning success of the UN and its gender initiatives. And then when I spoke to these women, it was again, their accounts and their experiences were really fascinating. So 120 of them, and the woman commander of this group. So they were housed separately. They were housed, which is often the case in some national contingents in peacekeeping missions. They were housed in sex segregated accommodations. And they actually told me that they weren't generally allowed to go out. They weren't allowed to leave the barracks. So all of the ways in which they did their work in the everyday context meant this limited mobility. And so they had to move around in these large groups. And they were also tasked to provide like close protection for Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the president of Liberia at the time. And so it was really, really interesting that this group of women was not allowed to go out on their own, except in these small groups, even though they were these highly trained weapons experts. And they would, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf had one or two private security guards around her, but then these convoys of Indian women police would follow, and they would be quite heavily armed. They'd have these quite significant sort of fatigues, military fatigues and weapons. So it was a real contrast to what they could and could not do in those spaces. And so I use the global color line to also look at, who's doing the majority of this labor, who's fronting and representing this kind of like gender equality, but what are the actual consequences, and what is the actual, sort of transformation of peacekeeping. And it was really funny because the commander told me, the woman commander told me, yes, of my 120 women, 118 are married. She just kept telling me this. I don't know why she was really concerned. Maybe I should have been more concerned by that, but she just kept telling me that, they're all married, and most of them have children, and the two that aren't, they're engaged. But she never told me any of that about any of the male contingents. And they were all male contingents, but they weren't called all male contingents, right? So, and they were actually of a completely different age group. They were a much wider spread from 20 to, upwards. And so there was a much larger distribution, whereas the women, for example, were sort of in their, in their early 30s upwards. There was no one younger than that, really. So it was a very different kind of professional grouping. Anyway, okay, so then I talk about, in the next chapter, I talk about really the kind of, and this is connected with that, the sort of limits of gender and how we've been thinking about gender. And I think that's really reflected when you go back to that old literature that I was talking to you about, because that's part of my project, is to like resuscitate this feminist, post-colonial and anti-militarist literature and sort of say, again, if we go back to that rather than kind of like continually try and improve peacekeeping and tinker with it, we might actually come up with some different suggestions or some different ways of thinking about it. So and again, a couple of examples was, related to these female peacekeepers. But what I found fascinating was that there was this expectation, and I wrote about this in an article specifically about these female peacekeepers from India, but also from Uruguay, was I think that there was this general assumption by the UN and perhaps by the peacekeepers themselves that by being deployed, that they would somehow have a natural affinity to local women, and that it would somehow be either comfort, even though they didn't have any gender expertise or gender training. Remember their training, right? Like crowd control, riot police, essentially. And then of course, and the women who were deployed in the Uruguayan military, they were not police, they were actually military. And the senior women were almost all medical staff, like the military dentist and the military doctor. But the lower ranking contingent were again fairly low ranking soldiers, right? That were not given a lot of authority or opportunity for leadership because they hadn't done their time. So they I was really fascinated, and with the idea that they might appeal to some notion of sisterhood. And so I turned back to intersectionality, which I've been using in a number of other ways. And what I did was to use intersectionality, really as a sensitizing concept. So if you've read all the stuff on intersectionality, well, you can't possibly have read all the stuff because it's like an industry in and of itself. As you know better than me, Ashley, because you're really the expert in the industry. No, yeah. But you're the expert on all of the multiple fields that draw on intersectionality. But what I thought would be interesting would be to use intersectionality less as a method or even as a buzzword, as Kathy Davis talks about it, but to think with it. And, potentially, if I could, bring intersectionality with me in terms of, what some scholars have advocated for is a kind of stewardship of intersectionality, like to use it sort of responsibly, or to use it with a certain amount of care for contributing to knowledge. So a different type of knowledge. So I used intersectionality to say, okay, well, how are these women, how are these female peacekeepers actually positioned in their own societies? And then how are they positioned vis-a-vis the peace kept? And there was obviously there was no natural affinity or notions of sisterhood. In fact, they had very developmental arguments. So the Indian women peacekeepers would tell me, like, oh, we've seen these young women on the streets, and we feel sorry for them because they don't have the opportunities that we had, or they don't have the safety of family, was a narrative they used. Or the Uruguayan female peacekeepers would often talk about how they could see themselves in the local women. So they use this kind of linear developmental argument that they were there, they were struggling and poor, for example, but that they made their way out of it, partly through entering the military, actually. So they had this real kind of social mobility sort of argument. And so they actually found it quite hard to relate. Of course, most of the male peacekeepers were not asked to relate on those kinds of terms with local people, but this was a very specific kind of gendered element of peacekeeping. But I think what was also problematic was that the UN had several kinds of developments, several kinds of initiatives. So one was to increase the number of female peacekeepers in an attempt to balance and change the culture of peacekeeping and reduce incidents of sexual exploitation and abuse. But they had a very specific notion of gender, and it was very much a kind of a binary of gender as social and sex as biological. And I think most of the focus on gender in the peacekeeping literature during the 2008 onwards until the contemporary really focuses on this single axis version of gender. And so again, that's why I drew on intersectionality, because intersectionality allowed me to pay attention to other axes of identity, but also of power. So the Indian women peacekeepers were both in a privileged position in some ways vis-a-vis the local women, but then they were also subject to marginalization and discrimination within the larger sort of peacekeeping labor sector. So that's what I tried to do with intersectionality in relation to gender. And then I guess I take that a little bit further because I see this focus in the UN's documentation and programming on gender as what Erin Belkin refers to as a foil, gender as a foil. Really, it hides the work of empire that's going on in peacekeeping, the kind of civilizing discourses that are prominent, or the other kinds of interventionist rescue narratives that you hear more broadly. Because if you focus on gender, then it doesn't sound so bad, So, and then in the last sort of sections of the book, I talk really about the commitments to martial politics that peacekeeping has. So I talk about I've been talking about peacekeepers, and I've been talking mostly about military peacekeepers, but of course there are civilian peacekeepers, there are peacekeepers that are human rights experts or lawyers or peace studies, people who have peace studies degrees. But the overriding culture of peacekeeping missions is that they are subject to military time and military space. So I was talking about peacekeeping as an epistemic project at the beginning, and like one of my fieldwork sort of memories is that back in 2006, when I was visiting Liberia, we had myself and another colleague who were doing the research. We had a driver that had been, that we recruited, and you'll like this story because you'll see the absurdity of, academics that try and do research in places and think that they'll be somehow sort of hidden in the landscape. So we were picked up at the airport by the driver in the car that we'd hired, like prearranged and hired. And we couldn't see it because it was late at night, and it was raining really, really heavily. And I remember we sort of like were looking down in the car as we were driving, and we like lifted up the mats from the bottom, and there were literally holes, like you could see the road underneath, and we were like, okay, let's just close those over. And we sort of thought it's late, and we won't think anything of it. Of course, in the morning when he came to pick us back up from the hotel and take us around different places, we could see that the vehicle we imagined like really a sort of similar vehicle to the UN, like some kind of white SUV that we'd be ferried around in, and that we'd kind of that I think is a real problematic notion that we had, which was that we saw ourselves as like a kind of a virtuous parallel to the UN. But this car was actually made up of two cars. So the front of the car was another color, and then the majority of the body of the car, the back bit, was a former taxi. So we had this car that really looked like a half taxi or 3/4 taxi. And every time we stopped and got out of the car, because we were taking pictures of billboards and things like UN signs about peacekeepers and so on, every time we got out of the vehicle, people would get in the back of the car, and the driver would get really upset. Okay, but I'm diverting from the driver. So that, at the end of a long day of interviewing people and speaking to local people and peacekeepers, you know, the driver said, okay, so, you know, are you ready to go back to the hotel? And we'd be like, yeah. And then we said, but, you know, unless you know, you have somewhere that you could take us or show us. And he was like, okay, yeah, actually, I'm going to take you back on a different route and show you some places. So he took us on this route back to the hotel that sort of went around the city, and this is in Monrovia. And then, of course, he'd taken this road many times before, and he came up to what was a checkpoint now and was a Swedish military base. And so there was a Swedish peacekeeper that came out and was like, you know, yes, what do you want? You know, and he was like, I want to go through here. You know, Paul, our driver, was like, I want to go through here. And the Swedish peacekeeper was like, you know, this is UN property, you can't go through here. And you know, and there was like this kind of really gendered, racialized face-off between these two men, you know, who were kind of staring each other down. And then Paul eventually sort of relented and turned around and then drove us back and another way. And he was like, you know, he was fuming in the car. And he was like, you know, I've always taken that route and I've always gone that way through that neighborhood. And, you know, and who are the UN to come here and tell me what I can do and, you know, how I can access the space. And again, it really struck me that the Marshall priority to have this base and the security of this base was really of the essence of the UN. And so there was not really an understanding on the peacekeepers' part. They were doing their job in terms of protecting the equipment of the UN. But yeah, it made me think about Marshall time and Marshall space as having the priority. So then, so how do I come to abolition? From intersectionality, how do I come to abolition? Well, I guess after I, you know, articulated the sort of the male domination of peacekeeping, the colonial legacies that are a part of peacekeeping, and the Marshall, I guess, imperative that's embedded. And I sort of like demonstrate through these examples how peacekeeping really can't be understood outside of those. Those are the sort of central tenets of peacekeeping. Like, I don't know what peacekeeping would look like if it didn't have those three sort of ingredients. And then I guess when I reached that end point of looking at the foundations, the sort of conceptual or the epistemic foundations of peacekeeping, then I thought, okay, well, you know, what do we do with similar institutions or similar organizations? If we looked at the police in a domestic context, we'd be advocating for defunding the police. Or if we looked at the military, for example, the US military in Afghanistan, or other kinds of military interventions in different places, we might advocate for defunding the military. And so then I started to think, well, why has it taken me 20 years to write this book and reach in a very short conclusion? Why have we not taken these ideas from other fields and other critiques into the peacekeeping literature? There's virtually nothing about abolition or ending peacekeeping. There's loads of books titled like, why does peacekeeping fail? How do we improve peacekeeping? There's two books that came out 5 years ago. One of them is called The Power of Peacekeeping by Lise Howard. Maybe some of you have come across it. I think it's a really good book. It's not in the critical studies camp, but it's actually a book about the power of peacekeeping to improve, right? Like if only the benchmarks, if only the threshold was much, much higher, if we, which is what Lise argues, that peacekeeping could be so much better, right? And it has the power, the capacity to do so much more. But I reached the opposite conclusion. Having looked at the power it holds, I reached the conclusion that the only logical for me option, and turning back to those feminists and those postcolonial and critical race scholars, the pacifists, the anti-militarists, the only thing that could be done really would be for us to, to end peacekeeping, to abolish peacekeeping. And some of the responses that I've had more recently when presenting the book is, and I should make people come in and wear either problem solving or critical approaches on their names, because a couple of the problem solving, I mean, they're friends and peers in the field, because it's not the biggest field in the world. And they, somebody who's from the problem solving school said, well, Marsha, you wrote your book, The End of Peacekeeping, but really peacekeeping is almost on its last legs anyway. So, what really, we're actually for the end of peacekeeping as well, because we think it's just, it needs to be born into another form. And I guess, that's one potential way of thinking about the end of peacekeeping, but really I'm talking about, abolishing it because of its racist, its patriarchal, its martial foundations. And then I guess the other thing that I do in moving towards this abolitionist perspective is to say, well, if you hold on to your critical feminist, postcolonial and anti-militarist scholars, if you bring them with you, if you bring your intersectional theory and your anti-carceral and your Black radical Marxist theories with you, amongst many others, if you bring your Chicana feminism, you will, you'll agree with me at the very least in thinking about the end of peacekeeping. Yeah, we'll stop there.
Thanks, Marsha, for that really exciting talk. We have a bunch of time for Q&A. When I facilitate Q&A, what I like to do is to take 5 minutes for you all to talk to each other, think about your question, to have a little, like a moment where you can really be thinking about what you want your question to be. That is not while someone else is asking a question or while Marsha is responding to a question. So we're going to take 5 minutes for either like quiet reflection or talking to each other, and then I'll bring you back and we'll do a full round of question and answer. So take 5. All right. Are you also like to yeah, exactly. I like
I know, yeah.
All right, welcome back. Really exciting to hear all of the energy in the room and all of the conversations and questions provoked by Dr. Henry's talk. So we're gonna open up the floor for some questions. I think we're gonna take a few and then have Dr. Henry respond, and then we'll come back and take a few rounds of questions. So would love, yes, please.
Yeah, one question I had was about this idea of the women peacekeepers, like needing to liaise with the local women or having this sort of relationship, and how explicit that was as a directive. Is that something that they would have been sort of told to do or appears in UN documentation, or is it a bit more subtle?
Great. Some other folks, questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your lectures. It's very inspiring. We were talking about peacekeeping, and it was a very nice conversation. My name is Maria Eduarda. I'm from the MGA, Master in Global Affairs, International Peace Studies concentration. And during my undergrad, I interviewed some Brazilian women that worked in the MONUSCO, in Congo. And they told me that they can work on the ground, but for example, the woman that is like the main woman of their group from UK, she cannot. So I would like to ask you, how do you see like the role of nationality in this working? And because I think it's also part of the intersectionality, because if these women are like from a developing country, they assume that their bodies are more valued than the women from the global south. So I'd like for you to share a bit about that. And also I have curiosity about how does Latin American perspective of feminists like Rita Segato or Maria Bonis, for example, have influenced your thoughts on feminist perspective. And the last one, I promise. I really appreciate the five chapter on the militarizing. So I would like for you to say more about how do you see the demilitarizing, and how does it is related to the idea of transforming militarized and violent masculinity? Because it's not enough just to have women, it's not enough just to have critical women working on the ground. It's also important to work in transforming masculinities, and it's not even a topic in the discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. We have like one more, yeah, just.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really exciting lecture. And also it's really helpful to think about how to use intersectionality more practically as well. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about like peacekeeping versus humanitarian aid and like the administration of aid and humanitarian organizations working in contexts. And how sort of humanitarian aid fits into your thinking.
Okay, I see you started off easy. We've elevated the game already. Okay, so thank you so much for those questions. You know, that's such a good question about women peacekeepers and the explicitness by which the UN, and I mean, that's something actually I was trying to dig into because I was trying to see if either these women were recruited through this narrative, you know, like, and it appealed to them, or whether they then were instructed when deployed suddenly with new tasks and things. And I couldn't really get to the bottom of it, but, you know, every time I asked them about their tasks, the Indian women, for example, they, you know, the commander, like the battalion, the equivalent of a battalion commander. But because they're police, it's not quite, it doesn't work in the same rank terms. She just kept saying, you know, they're expected to do everything that their male counterparts are expected to do. Like, it was really interesting that she kept coming back to this like baseline of everyone is the same, which, you know, and they're expected to do all of the same tasks that, you know, there's no differentiation based on gender. But then, for example, she told me about some of the things that they were, you know, that they were doing to kind of, I guess, develop the group both professionally and personally, and to mitigate the homesickness that people had. So that was something that was identified as a significant factor affecting the Indian women peacekeepers. And so they did activities like, they would hire someone to come and teach them French, for example, even though that wasn't a requirement in any way in working terms. So they had this idea of like, maybe they might be then selected to go on a different mission to a Francophone region. They then set up Bollywood dance classes for local women and then had them come to the classes. And again, nobody's specifically trained in any of this, but nevertheless. And then they also had programs that were encouraged, officially encouraged. So none of these programs were formally mandated, but programs to kind of like get more women to come into the hospital, the clinic unit that they had attached to them. So actually encouraging local women to come in and get, you know, to get health checks, reproductive health sort of matters. And just, so that was like a kind of, that was both an official suggestion from the UN, but it wasn't, again, it wasn't mandated as part of their duty. So it's really interesting about what people do in the informal. In fact, I was really interested in the informal activities of peacekeepers. The Uruguayan women, for example, had, and this kind of connects actually with the question about different nationalities. So most militaries have a no fraternization rule. So they're not, but of course that's a bit difficult sometimes to define, because you have to interact with local people to access accommodation and different things, especially officers do, and just all kinds of things. So in the Uruguayan battalion, it was fascinating because they only had one. In the Uruguayan battalion was in Haiti, so was not in Liberia, but in Haiti, in the Uruguayan battalion, the Uruguayan officer, there was only one officer who could speak French and not even Creole. So she was literally tasked to do everything that required engagement with the local population. So in fact, there was no fraternization issue in a way, because I know people tried in different contexts, but yeah, so there was like a couple of, there is a tradition of generally very privileged class in Latin America of going to Napoleonic school system, in which case you would generally have like French immersion, or you would often be bilingual in French. So this officer was, but it was interesting because the labor that she was involved in doing was like anything that needed translation work. She was there, and not being able to do her daily dentistry work, which was kind of an unusual situation. Anyway, I think that there's a big difference. I think what female peacekeepers are actually officially mandated to do is not articulated in gender terms explicitly. But the UN capitalizes in a lot of their promotional material. They talk about the benefits of female peacekeepers, but again, not specifically mandated to do them. And then in terms of like the Brazilian peacekeepers, I also did work with Brazilian peacekeepers in Haiti, and they have an interesting reputation and connection with Haitian people, for example. So one of the things that endeared in some of the deployments that endeared Brazilian peacekeepers to local Haitians was that they immediately put like on the tanks. So think about this kind of contradiction in peace terms on the military tanks, which are already branded with the UN. Then on one side of the tank would be the Brazilian flag, and on the other, the Haitian flag. And then that sort of like meant a certain kind of connection and affinity that local people had, because then they saw, and this of course was not in sort of this translated as in football terms, like in soccer terms. This then had another kind of connection. And lots of local people complained about complicity between Brazilian elite forces who were doing like different types of security missions in various areas outside of Port-au-Prince. And lots of people complained that basically they couldn't tell the difference between gang members and peacekeepers, because so many of the gang members started to wear militarized clothing that then, resembled the peacekeeping uniforms. So yeah, in terms of like the valuation of Latin American perspectives, I mean, thank you for mentioning Lugones, because I actually talk about the coloniality of gender in relation to the global color line, but also in relation to the bulk of peacekeeping labor, or at least the bulk of female peacekeepers who are doing this labor, are almost all from the global South. And what I didn't say was that in the case of Uruguayan women, Brazilian women, as well as women from Chile and from Argentina, they along with South Asian women peacekeepers from Bangladesh and from India, they were able to be peacekeepers in these missions precisely because there was another economic structure of care that was taken, that elsewhere that enabled them. So all of them had, mothers, sisters, aunts, nannies, domestic labor to take care of their children or to manage households so that they could go on these placements and deployments. So there were multiple layers of this political economy going on. There was the political economy of the peacekeeping mission itself, and then the wider gender division of domestic and reproductive labor as well. So, and I used Lugones' coloniality of gender really to think about like which individual, like which peacekeepers are considered of value and are considered to be part of the category of human, for starters, really, as a way of thinking, extending intersectionality further. Yeah, so thank you for that. Okay, so you asked a question about masculinity, and I can give you some examples about masculinity from my field work, perhaps, but maybe I answer the humanitarian aid question and then come back to the masculinity further on. So, it's a good question. I didn't really, so part of the analysis that I do in the book is to look, I like to extend the work on spaces and to look at like humanitarian aid, what the late Lisa Smurl refers to as these spaces of aid. She looks at enclaves and compounds, and then she looks at vehicles as well as these instruments to take people in very sheltered ways, to take humanitarian workers, to keep them in a sort of shadow kind of work economy. But yeah, thinking about humanitarian aid, I can maybe reflect on the early mission in Liberia in 2006, when I was there in 2006. That mission was like the first, I think, one of the first integrated missions. And what they did with that mission was put all development agencies, all UN development agencies, under the command and leadership of the peacekeeping mission. So you can imagine the kinds of problems that created for like some development workers had long-standing 20 years plus of relationships and trust with local populations. And then the peacekeepers kind of come in, set up the mission, and then these development workers are subject to this UN military leadership. So there was a lot of, I think, there was a lot of conflict between what would be humanitarian aid, development aid, and then the sort of goals of a peacekeeping mission. And there was, and then I think that also affected, for example, like Médecins Sans Frontières and other big NGOs that had established themselves as neutral actors in those regions, neutral actors. Then peacekeepers would be negotiating security for those aid actors and compromising some of the relationships. So I think there's probably, I'm probably not as best equipped to answer that as perhaps others. I'm thinking of Monique Beerley at Geneva and Mafanui James and at LSE, who does stuff on NGOs and other humanitarian aids, but maybe we could discuss that more after, or other people have ideas. Yeah, do you want to take some more questions and then I can come back to the military masculinities?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sam. I'll ask a question that came up in our small group. So I guess when we talk about abolition, there's often like a question of like, well, what's the alternative?
Yeah.
And I guess I'm curious if there is a role for like a global / international peacekeeping force, and if it's like possible to imagine a decolonial alternative, or how you respond to the question that I imagine comes of like, well, what's the other option if people believe that it's that there is some role for international peacekeeping.
I had the same question, so maybe I can just build on
Yeah.
yours and just to parallel it to kind of police abolition. One strategy that people use is to kind of bifurcate the roles of policing and to say, okay, maybe these pieces are abolished, but these pieces are a separate agency for mental health or whatnot. Where the missions of peacekeeping are singular in mission, I guess. Is there that same space for kind of bifurcation or like, expansion of the various roles that they fill?
Also potentially relating to this and thinking about abolition, I'm wondering if sort of the petering off of an industry or an effort results in different outcomes than like an abolition of it. And already thinking about some of the ideas you mentioned you've gotten from colleagues about like transformations and new alternatives, if those emerge differently when you kind of just gradually taper off and new things get thrown out there into the world, or if there's like a strategic, like we need to cut this off and we're gonna think about what the future looks like more, I don't know, intentionally, I guess.
Let's take Ade and Lisa, and then we're gonna cut it off. Then.
More in that line of thinking about this, what it would mean to imagine a new way of peacekeeping. For years, there have been a bunch of articles on UN peacekeeping and rates of rape and sexual assault within the regions that they're situated in. And when you mentioned like the UN using the gender of the female peacekeepers as sort of like a good thing. I'm wondering if you're seeing conversations surrounding using more female peacekeepers in order to sort of, as a response to this critique of UN peacekeepers engaging in sexual assault within the stations that they're placed in. And are you seeing that conversation happening as a way to, as sort of a new way of thinking of peacekeeping? In other words, if we put female peacekeepers here, we will have less sexual assault and rape allegations, and that might be a solution.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming and being in this conversation with us. So have you looked at civilian peacekeeping, and do you know this literature? So my first book in 1995 was on civilian peacekeeping, which was kind of growing out of Cynthia Coburn's work and really looking at a decolonial civil society approach to these problems. So I wondered if you were engaging with them.
Okay.
We've got like 17 minutes
Okay.
to respond to that.
Okay, well, I don't
Solve
have to take,
abolition for us.
I don't have to take 17 minutes, but, so maybe I'll start at the end because it relates back to the first questions anyway, which is, I guess, so I've been asked, virtually at every talk I've been asked by different people for different reasons, you know, is there anything that can be salvaged? Is there something that, you know, you want to hold on to, or is there something that you already have an imagination about? Or are there alternatives that just really haven't been, you know, looked at? And I guess if I start from the what I hoped the book would originally, what I hoped it would do would be to give us space to think differently. Like, I mean, one downside of the book, and I promised myself that the next book would be more generative, because I feel like the book is a massive critique of, you know, it really lives up to the critical approaches bit. But I feel like at some point that, you know, that becomes quite tiresome and depressing. You know, I'd love to have something, and one of the limitations of focusing on critique is that I do something that I critique others for doing, which is that others neglect the peace kept, and then I do the same, although perhaps more cognizantly and more as an exercise in what can happen. So I think that there's something that I have, and probably everybody has, which is some kind of, and again, very different reasons. I think that we have some kind of attachment. I mean, you know, I'm speaking on behalf of you, but you can tell me otherwise. We have some kind of attachment to the possibilities of what peacekeeping could symbolize or mean. And I think that those attachments and those ideas, well, again, I could critique them and say they come from what, you know, Lily Ling and Anna Agathandrelou talk about as this desire industries, you know, or they could be from, I think I've been reflecting on this recently. I think for me, they come from my wish to be more of a pacifist. And so I can't critique it only. I want to look for something, for a different way of imagining the world and a different way of working with people who are not as privileged as me. So, yeah, that's not answering any of those questions. So, a couple of people have talked about, I think there's people better qualified to talk about, you included, to talk about alternatives that already have existed. And not, even calling them an alternative is recentering the Marshall Project of peacekeeping. So I think these different ways of thinking and engaging with peace have already have a life of their own. They just need to be foregrounded. I think in terms of, maybe that's what I'll say about that. And maybe the book is partly a call to problem-solving peacekeepers to read more widely and to read differently, minimally. In terms of the sexual assault allegations, that's one of the things that I try and do in that chapter, is to really unpack that idea that the UN is very two-faced about, in that they're not very, it doesn't take very much. They are quite weak narrators anyway, because they say, oh, we need more female peacekeepers. And then if they really believed that, and I think it shows that where female peacekeepers are present. Wow. That's a whole new research project. Where female peacekeepers are present, there are lower rates of, or lower numbers of allegations around sexual exploitation and abuse, but not necessarily in local communities more broadly. But then research has shown that female peacekeepers are often deployed to areas where the levels of violence and sexual and gender-based violence have not been as high in the first place. So what is the cause and consequence? But really, if the UN was serious about it, they would send a all-female peacekeeping unit and then see what happens. But so the UN's excuse is usually things like, well, we take military personnel based on voluntary contributions, like not, troop contributing countries come to us and they say we have this many troops available, and so we take them, and feminist lawyers have been saying for years that's just not good enough. Like, you can't send troops and military personnel to regions just because that's what has come to you. You still have to follow your own policies and your own aspirational goals. So yeah, I don't think they're really committed. And in that way, I think it is a continuation of a foil. And there's and the Canadian government, just to take another dig at them, they for example, a couple of years ago developed the LC initiative, which is a big funding project to look at and study female peacekeepers. And one of the key questions that they posted all over social media was like, what are the barriers to increasing the number of female peacekeepers? And I was like, really? Like, that's your question? Because, you could just ask somebody on the street. That does not require a study. But then when you look at what were they trying to do, they're actually trying to look at military structures, organizational structures, but there's a whole literature on discriminatory practices and policies, and they're not willing to address any of those because they're an exceptional institution and organization. So, stuff like not deploying somebody for a year, deploying someone for 3 months, 6 months, having rotation, timeshare, those kinds of things. But that sounds like I'm advocating for reform of the military. So I think that's important in terms of in terms of alternatives. So I'd love to start with another group of people, not start with the peacekeeping scholars, who I think are actually the least equipped to be making those decisions. So I think those civil society organizations, artists, musicians, filmmakers. Like, I think there's a whole humanities set, you know, I was just thinking about all the literary works that I found imagined a world so different. I mean, not like that those texts can somehow transcend these colonial or martial politics in some sort of romantic way, but they imagine and they frame things so differently, and we often in the scholarship don't turn to any of those. So I think that there is, I guess, maybe just on that, as a final note, on that question, Razik was asked in 2004. She talks about in the conclusion of her book how she was asked, well, what would you do then? You know, like, what are you doing in the face of like people being, you know, massacred or people being killed? Then, you know, what should you do? Like, peacekeeping seems like a necessary, a necessary a response. And she's like, well, you know, but that's not my project is about this. And then let's find out what kind of imagination is possible once we dwell on those. And I think that issue of petering off is a really, really interesting one, because, you know, in so many, I don't think the police, well, maybe the police are also experiencing something similar, you know, a real decline, I mean, perhaps I don't know if it's statistically at an all-time low of mistrust. I think about other places where they have very high levels of trust in police, like in Japan, for example. They are the least, the Japanese police do not want to be involved in peacekeeping. They don't want to be deployed. They were deployed to South Sudan, and they requested never to be sent again because they didn't have any policing experience that they felt would be relevant and could be used. Their experience of policing was not, not engaging with such high levels of violence that they were witnessing in local police. So it's interesting to think about, I guess, institutions that are in material decline, are in real-time decline and symbolic decline. And I guess probably not as many people care about the incidents of, I mean, I'm thinking about a former force commander, a general in the Netherlands military. And he once did this presentation. The Netherlands Defense Academy had a conference that was organized on sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual and gender-based violence and conflict. And the Netherlands Defense Academy teamed up with a whole bunch of feminist legal scholars from Emory, and they held this conference together. It was a fantastic conference. But the opening event was this general, this Netherlands, this Dutch general, who presented his experiences of working in the DRC as a senior police, a senior peacekeeper, a commander. And he had, as he was presenting, he had this massive slide, like it was, it was like, and he had images that he had taken of corpses that he had taken while he was on different patrols. And his argument was that while sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers was really something to be frowned upon, it didn't even compare to the level of gender-based violence committed by the Congolese military against the local people. And we were all just sitting there with no warning whatsoever that these images were coming up. And it's just so that there is a kind of there is a desire on the part of people who were formerly part of these peacekeeping sort of empires to return to and somehow preserve this notion of peacekeeping as a virtuous and as an honorable practice, and to resurrect it from its petering out. So I think there's a lot of powerful figures that want it to be, to be sort of reinstated at the level. And and there's, there's a wonderful documentary made by a German filmmaker, Karen Jurzik, who it's called The Peacekeepers and the Women. And it's available through Women Make Movies. And that film is, again, shows the power of very specific peacekeeping men to influence whole missions, whole peacekeeping doctrine, peacekeeping policies, peacekeeping practices. So yeah, again, not sure I'm answering your question about the petering out, but I'm just thinking about these actually very powerful figures who continue to kind of shape the future of peacekeeping. And so even though there are some very practical elements, or there's some very practical arguments for its decline, I think there's lots of people heavily invested in maintaining it as a post-conflict practice. Yeah. I said I wasn't going to speak for 17 minutes, but I think I just did.
You're right on time. Thank you so much.